Settle into your bed. Let your body grow heavy and still, and let your thoughts drift across the sand toward a river that has flowed for 10,000 years. Tonight, we travel to the beginning of Egypt itself. Long before there were kings to rule the black soil of Egypt, before temples rose along the riverbanks, there was only Nut, the sky, arched high above her husband Geb, the earth, who lay beneath her like a sleeping giant covered in green fields and red desert. Nut's body was scattered with stars, and each night she swallowed the sun so that it might be born again from her each morning. Geb, in turn, held rivers and mountains within the folds of his skin, dreaming the slow dreams of stone and soil. Between the two of them, the world held its breath. Where Nut curved overhead in deep blue silence, her fingertips brushing the eastern horizon and her toes resting against the western edge where the sun disappeared each evening, Geb stretched beneath her in an endless green and gold. On his chest grew the wheat fields. Along his arms wound the marshes. In the hollow of his hand, the Nile collected itself before spilling southward toward the sea. They were the oldest couple in the world, and the world between them was everything that had ever been or would ever be. From this union came 4 children, born across 5 days that did not belong to any calendar. Days won in a game of drafts played by the god Thoth against the moon itself. The firstborn was Osiris, arriving with the soft light of dawn already resting on his brow. After him came Horus the elder, then Set, whose entrance tore through his mother's side with a violence that unsettled the other gods. Then came the sisters Isis and Nephthys, each carrying a different kind of quiet strength. It was said that when Osiris was born, a voice rang out across every shore and every market in the known world, carried on the wind the way a temple bell carries across still water. The voice announced that the Lord of all things had come into being. Shepherds in distant valleys looked up from their flocks. Fishermen paused at their nets. Even the crocodiles along the river, ancient and slow as stone, lifted their great heads briefly before settling back into the mud. Something had changed in the world, though few could have explained what. Osiris grew unlike any god before him. Where other deities were content to remain distant and unknowable, Osiris looked down upon the wandering tribes of the Nile Valley and felt something close to tenderness. He watched men and women dig for roots with their bare hands, watched them go hungry when the floods came too early or too late, watched them huddle together against the cold desert nights without walls to shelter them. It stirred in him a wish to help, and that wish would shape everything that followed. When Osiris took the throne of Egypt, he did not rule as a distant figure hidden behind palace walls. He walked among the reed villages himself, sat beside farmers at their fires, and showed them how to press seed into the black earth left behind by the Nile's retreat. He taught them the rhythm of the river, how to read its rise and fall, how to build canals that carried water to fields far from the banks. Wheat and barley began to grow in orderly rows where wild grasses had once tangled without purpose. He gave the people more than farming. He taught them how to press grapes into wine, how to coax bread from grain through fire and patience, how to shape simple laws that let neighbors settle disputes without bloodshed. Under his guidance, scattered clans began to see themselves as one people, bound together by shared rivers, shared gods, and shared harvests. Villages grew into towns, and towns raised the first modest temples where offerings of grain and beer were left for the gods who had given so much. His wife, Isis, ruled beside him with a mind as sharp as his heart was warm. While Osiris carried his teachings to distant valleys and even beyond Egypt's borders, sailing to far shores to share his knowledge with other peoples, Isis remained to govern the kingdom, and her wisdom proved equal to any crown. She studied the old magic of the world, the secret names of things, the words that could heal a wound or calm a storm. Together they were spoken of with a reverence usually reserved for the sun itself. The land prospered as it never had before. Granaries filled. Children grew tall and unafraid of famine. Musicians composed songs in the marketplaces, and priests began to write down the stories of the gods on papyrus reeds pressed thin and smoothed to a pale gold. Egypt, in those early years, felt like a garden tended by careful hands. In the years of Osiris's reign, the towns of Egypt began to take on a shape they would hold for thousands of years to come. Along the western bank of the Nile, where the sun descended each evening, the people built their burial grounds, for it was the side of ending and of rest. Along the eastern bank, where each morning the horizon brightened before the sun crested the cliffs, they built their homes and their temples, for it was the side of beginnings. The temples rose slowly, over generations of labor, shaped from limestone carried by barge along the river. Their walls were smoothed and painted with scenes of gods receiving offerings, of kings performing sacred rites, of farmers and scribes and weavers going about their work beneath divine protection. Columns were carved to resemble papyrus stalks, their capitals opening like flowers toward the sky. Obelisks were raised at temple entrances, their tips capped an electrum that caught the first light of dawn and threw it in long golden threads across the ground. Inside these temples, priests moved through corridors of lamplight carrying offerings of bread and linen, oil and flowers. The innermost room of each temple held the image of the god it honored, bathed and anointed and dressed each morning as though preparing a living king for the day. It was understood that the god did not dwell in the statue itself, but that the statue served as a resting place, a point of contact between the divine realm and the human world. The rituals were a way of maintaining that contact, of keeping the boundary between heaven and earth permeable enough that prayers might pass through. Osiris watched these rituals from his position among the gods with something between satisfaction and wonder. He had not asked the people to build for him. He had only shared what he knew of planting and law and the keeping of time, and from that sharing had grown something far greater than he had imagined. A civilization with its own voice, its own beauty, its own way of reaching toward the sky. There came a season when Osiris resolved to carry his teachings beyond Egypt's borders entirely. The world was wide, and other peoples lived in it who had never heard of the Nile's flooding rhythms, who did not yet know how to coax crops from soil, who spent their days in the same hand-to-mouth wandering that Egypt's earliest tribes had known before his arrival. He felt the same pull toward them that he had felt toward his own people, a wish to give rather than withhold. He sailed first along the northern coast, where the sea moved in long rolling swells of deep green, and the coastline was broken by harbors sheltering small fishing communities. He arrived among them as a traveler, without the trappings of a king, sitting among them in the evenings and asking what they struggled with, what the land gave easily and what it withheld. When he learned they had fertile soil but did not yet plant it deliberately, he showed them, working alongside them in the mornings with his own hands in the earth. From the coast he traveled inland across ranges of hills where goatherds moved with their small flocks across stony ground. He traveled through river valleys broader and colder than the Nile, where forests of cedar and oak covered the slopes and the light was green and filtered rather than the bright golden wash of Egypt. Everywhere he went he adapted what he knew. Farming in a cedar forest valley required different thinking than farming on the banks of the Nile, and Osiris had the patience to understand each place before he offered it anything. He carried with him a small cedar staff, not as a weapon but as a walking tool and a symbol. Wherever people asked who he was, he answered simply that he was a traveler who had learned a few things worth sharing. The gods do not always announce themselves, and in those foreign lands, far from the temples where his image was painted in gold and lapis, Osiris preferred the company of a good question to the weight of ceremony. Back in Egypt, Isis governed with the steadiness the kingdom required. She held court each morning in a hall where the columns were painted to resemble the night sky, dark blue scattered with gold stars, and she listened to the reports of scribes and administrators and village chiefs with a patience that matched her husband's own. Her decisions were measured and fair, and the kingdom, though its king was far away, held its shape as cleanly as a well-thrown pot. Not every heart in the family of gods rejoiced at what Osiris had built. Set, his brother, watched the celebrations from the edges of the palace courtyards with a stillness that unsettled those who noticed it. Where Osiris had been born into gentle light, Set had entered the world through struggle, and something of that struggle never left him. He ruled the red deserts beyond the fertile valley, a land of scorching wind and shifting dunes, while his brother governed the green abundance of the river. It was a fair division by the old order of the gods, yet fairness rarely soothes envy. The desert was not without beauty, and Set knew its beauty well. He knew the way a dune cast its shadow at late afternoon, a deep blue-purple curve against the burning red of the surrounding sand. He knew the cold clarity of desert nights when stars burned so brightly and with such stillness that the whole sky seemed to be holding its breath. He knew the hard, stripped-down honesty of a land that offered nothing that was not earned. He had made himself the lord of all of it and was, in certain moods, proud of what he ruled. But pride in the desert did not erase the sting of watching the valley. Set watched farmers bring their harvests to Osiris with garlands of lotus flowers. He watched foreign travelers arrive with gifts, eager to learn the secrets of irrigation and law that had transformed a scattering of hungry tribes into a flourishing kingdom. He heard poets in the marketplace singing of Osiris as the most beloved king the world had known, and something cold settled into his chest each time the songs reached his ears. Isis noticed the change in her brother-in-law long before Osiris did. She saw how Set's eyes lingered too long on the throne, how his silence at feasts had grown heavier, how his desert winds seemed to blow with more force whenever news arrived of another triumph in the Green Valley. She spoke of her worries to Osiris gently, the way one might mention a cloud on an otherwise clear horizon. Osiris, ever generous in spirit, could not imagine that his own brother might wish him harm. He believed, as kind hearts often do, that love shared freely would eventually be returned in kind. Set did not act in haste. Months passed, and then a full turning of the seasons, before he began the quiet work of drawing others into his confidence. He chose carefully, selecting men and women who had their own reasons for discontent, those who had asked favors of Osiris and been refused, those who envied the prosperity of the valley from kingdoms on its edges, those who simply enjoyed belonging to a secret. He met with them individually in places where no one else would think to listen, in desert camps by night, in the back rooms of merchants' houses on boats far from shore. He told each of them something different, shaped to fit their particular grievance. To one he spoke of how the world's power was poorly distributed, of how a single family had held Egypt's crown for too long. To another he spoke of opportunity, of how those who acted boldly at the right moment found themselves richly rewarded. To a third he said nothing beyond suggesting that what was about to happen would be significant, and that it would be better to be on the right side of significance than on the wrong one. By the time he had spoken to 72 of them, a number that in later years would carry a kind of ceremonial weight, the plan had already taken shape in its outline. He had not yet told most of them what the plan was. He had only secured their willingness to follow his lead when the moment arrived. That was enough. Set had always understood that an action undertaken by many is harder to undo than one carried out by few. He waited then, with the same patience he had shown the desert during its slow months of drought. He waited for Osiris to return from his travels. He waited for a moment when the kingdom would be settled and relaxed, when no one would be watching the horizon for trouble. He waited until the season of abundance, when the harvest was in and the granaries were full and the whole of Egypt was in a mood to celebrate. Set began his plan with patience, the way a desert waits for a single drop of rain to fall in exactly the right place. He traveled in secret to distant lands and had a chest built from fragrant cedar wood, its surface inlaid with gold and precious stones, its shape carved to match, with exact and terrible precision, the measurements of his brother's body. No one else could have fit inside it. That detail was the entire purpose of the design. The craftsmen who built the chest were told it was a gift for a great king, which was, in a crooked way, the truth. They worked for many weeks, fitting the cedar planks together with copper nails and aromatic resin, inlaying the lid with bands of lapis lazuli and carnelian, in patterns that mimicked the traditional designs of a royal sarcophagus. They were proud of what they made. It was among the finest work any of them had produced, and they sent it on its way without knowing what purpose it had been built to serve. When the chest was finished, Set arranged a great feast in Osiris's honor, inviting the 72 conspirators along with many innocent guests who suspected nothing. Torches lit the hall in warm amber light. Musicians played reed flutes while dancers moved in slow circles, and cups of wine were passed from hand to hand beneath garlands of blue lotus. Osiris arrived smiling, glad to celebrate among family and friends, unaware that the evening had been built entirely around him. Partway through the feast, servants carried in the magnificent chest and set it at the center of the hall. Gasps of admiration rippled through the guests at its beauty. Set rose with a cup in his hand and announced, in a voice smooth with false generosity, that the chest would belong to whichever guest fit inside it perfectly. One by one, the guests stepped forward and tried, laughing as they discovered themselves too tall, too short, too broad across the shoulders. The game passed pleasantly around the hall until, at last, it came to Osiris. He climbed into the chest without suspicion, settling into a shape that matched his own as though it had been poured around him like water finding its container. Before he could rise again, the conspirators surged forward. They slammed the lid shut, sealed its edges with molten lead, and carried the chest to the banks of the Nile, where they cast it into the current under a moonless sky. The river, ever patient, carried the sealed cedar box downstream and out toward the great sea, away from the kingdom that had loved its king so completely. When word reached Isis that her husband had vanished, she did not weep for long before she began to search. She cut off a lock of her hair and put aside her royal garments, dressing instead in the simple linen of a wandering mourner, and set out along the riverbanks to ask every reed cutter, fisherman, and child whether they had seen a golden chest pass by. Her devotion carried her far beyond the borders of Egypt, across marshlands and coastal towns, following rumors carried on the wind. The Nile's current had carried the chest all the way to the shores of Byblos, where it came to rest among the roots of a young tamarisk tree. Over time the tree grew around the chest entirely, its trunk thickening until the cedar box lay hidden and protected deep within the living wood. The tree grew tall and fragrant, admired throughout the region for its beauty, until the king of that land ordered it cut down to serve as a pillar for his palace hall, never suspecting what it carried inside. Isis arrived in Byblos following whispers of a remarkable tree that had been turned into a palace pillar, and something in her heart recognized the truth before her mind fully understood it. She took work as a nursemaid to the queen's infant son, gentle and unassuming, gaining the trust of the royal household over quiet weeks of service. She was seen as a kind and capable woman who sang strange songs at night and who burned something fragrant in a small clay dish, a habit the household found unusual but harmless. In the quiet hours of the night, she would sit beside the great pillar, resting her hand upon the fragrant wood, feeling the shape of her husband's resting place beneath the bark. She spoke to him in low murmurs, not expecting a reply, but needing to speak nonetheless. The palace was still around her. The lamps burned low. Outside, the sea moved in steady rhythm against the harbor walls, indifferent and eternal. When the time came, she revealed her true nature to the king and queen of Byblos, and moved by her sorrow and her devotion, they allowed her to take the pillar apart and remove the chest from within. She carried the cedar box back toward Egypt by ship, cradling it as though it were the most precious cargo the sea had ever known, and for a brief while, it seemed as though her long search had reached its end. Isis brought the chest to a hidden marsh in the Nile Delta, a quiet place tangled with papyrus reeds, where she believed her husband's body would rest safely while she gathered the strength and the knowledge to attempt his restoration. She opened the chest at last and wept over him, pressing her face to his still form, breathing in the scent of cedar and distant sea air that clung to his skin. But Set had not stopped searching for his brother's remains. Hunting one night beneath a full moon in the marshlands, he came upon the hidden chest and recognized, with a fury that shook the reeds around him, that his plan had been undone by his sister-in-law's devotion. Determined that Osiris would never rise again, he scattered the body across the length of Egypt, casting the pieces into different regions of the river and the land so that no single search might ever recover them all. Isis returned to find the chest empty, and for the first time in her long search, despair threatened to overtake her resolve. Yet grief in her had always transformed into purpose rather than surrender. She called upon her sister Nephthys, who had quietly grown estranged from her husband Set and now stood firmly at Isis's side. Together, the two sisters resolved to walk every riverbank, every marsh, every stretch of desert until each fragment of Osiris had been found and honored. The journey that followed was not swift. Could not be. The land of Egypt was long and varied, stretching from the green delta in the north where the Nile fanned out into a dozen channels and the air tasted of salt and river mud, all the way south to the cataracts where the water tumbled white and fast over black granite boulders and the sky was wider and hotter than anywhere else on earth. To travel its length was to pass through a world that seemed, in many places, to belong to entirely different stories. Isis and Nephthys traveled much of the way by water, their papyrus boat low and steady on the current. Sometimes they paddled through narrow channels where the reeds on either bank grew so tall and close that the sky above them was reduced to a single stripe of blue. The air in those places smelled of green things and dark mud, of water that had been still long enough to develop a character of its own. Dragonflies hovered at the prow. Frogs announced their presence from the banks at dusk. At other times the sisters walked, following tracks along the desert edge where the fertile land gave way to sand, and the light was different, harder and more direct, casting shadows that were crisp-edged and short. They spoke to everyone they encountered. Village women grinding grain, old men watching the river from shaded doorways, children who had seen strange things float past on the current and remembered details with the unself-conscious precision that children bring to anything that strikes them as remarkable. Nephthys proved an unexpected companion in her steadiness. She was quieter than her sister, less inclined to explain what she was feeling, but her presence beside Isis was a kind of ballast that kept the search moving when weariness threatened to stall it. When Isis grew exhausted, Nephthys would take the paddle. When grief rose up suddenly and without warning, as it did on certain evenings when the light turned golden and the river looked exactly as it had on afternoons long past, Nephthys would sit close without speaking, which was often the most useful thing anyone could do. The sisters traveled together in their small papyrus boat, drifting along canals and tributaries, asking the herons and the crocodiles, the reeds and the river itself, to reveal what had been hidden within them. Wherever they found a piece of Osiris, they paused to build a small shrine, burying the fragment with reverence and marking the place so that it might never be forgotten. In this way, shrines rose across the villages of Egypt, and in later generations, many towns would proudly claim to hold a resting place of the great king within their soil. The search stretched across many seasons. Isis called upon the god Thoth for guidance, and upon Anubis, the keeper of embalming rites, who joined the sisters in their labor once enough of the pieces had been gathered together. Anubis was not an easy presence, for he moved with the quiet certainty of one who has spent much time at the boundary between the living and the dead, and those who encountered him for the first time sometimes felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the air. But he was gentle in his work and he was thorough. With careful hands, Anubis began the long and delicate work of binding the fragments back into a whole, wrapping the body in linen soaked with fragrant resins, an art that would one day become the sacred practice of embalming for every soul in Egypt who hoped for a peaceful afterlife. He worked in a space sheltered from the sun by palm frond canopies, moving slowly and with purpose, speaking low words over the linen as he wrapped it. The scent of natron and cedar oil drifted across the marshes. Only one piece of Osiris was never recovered, for it had been swallowed by a fish in the river, and no shrine could be raised for what the water itself had claimed. Isis, undiscouraged even by this loss, shaped what was needed from her own magic. determined that her devotion would not be incomplete simply because the river had kept one small secret for itself. When the work of gathering was done, and the body of Osiris lay assembled and wrapped upon a cedar board in the filtered light of the marsh, Anubis performed for the first time the rites that would become, over the centuries, one of the most elaborate sacred practices the world had ever known. He washed the body with water from the Nile, water that carried in it the memory of every rainfall and every mountain snowmelt that had ever found its way to Egypt. He anointed it with oils pressed from cedar and myrrh and spikenard, oils that had been carried by traders from far forests and hillside gardens, oils whose fragrance would cling to the wrappings for centuries beyond counting. He applied natron, a salt drawn from desert lakes, packing it carefully into every fold, drawing out the moisture that decay required so that what remained would endure. Then came the linen, roll after roll of it, the finest grade, woven so tightly and smoothed so carefully that each strip was nearly translucent, and through it the lamplight passed in a warm reddish glow. Anubis wrapped each limb individually before wrapping the whole, and between the layers he tucked small protective amulets, carved from faience and carnelian, tiny figures of gods whose names were spells in themselves. The heart scarab was placed above the breast, carved with a prayer that asked the heart not to speak against its owner in the hall of judgment. He spoke the words of protection over the finished form, and the marsh fell quiet around him as he did. Even the frogs paused their calling. Even the wind in the reeds held itself still for a moment. Isis and Nephthys stood at the head and foot of their brother, their arms raised in the gesture of embrace, their shadows falling long across the ground in the late afternoon light. What Anubis had made here was not merely a preserved body. He had created a vessel, a form that the soul of Osiris could recognize as its home, something to return to, something permanent in a world where everything else dissolved back into the river and the soil. The rites would be repeated for every important person in Egypt for the next 3,000 years, each one a quiet echo of what had been done here first, in the reeds. For a king the world had lost and would never quite stop mourning. When the body of Osiris lay whole again, wrapped in linen and resting beneath the shelter of the marsh reeds, Isis transformed herself into a kite, a small falcon-like bird with wings the color of dusk. She circled her husband's still form and settled upon him, and through magic drawn from love as much as from ancient words of power, she conceived a child even as Osiris remained among the dead. This child would be Horus, born with the sharp eyes of a falcon and a destiny that would one day carry him into conflict with his uncle Set for the throne of Egypt. But that is a story for another night, one that belongs to Horus's own long and winding path toward justice. For now, it is enough to know that from sorrow and devotion, new life had quietly begun. Hidden among the reeds where the river moved slow and dark beneath a canopy of stars, Isis raised her son in secret within the marshes, hiding him from Set's searching eyes, protected by crocodiles who had once feared the old gods and now, out of respect for her grief, allowed her passage without harm. The papyrus thickets became a nursery, the call of herons a lullaby, and the golden light through the reeds a gentle roof over a hidden prince. The child grew with the marshes around him as his entire world. He learned the names of birds before he learned the names of kings. He could read the direction of wind from the way the papyrus stalks leaned, and he understood which channels were safe for swimming and which were watched by crocodiles who had not yet received the word that this family was to be left unmolested. He moved through the green corridors of the delta as quietly as a heron, and with nearly the same patience. Isis taught him everything she knew, and she knew a great deal. She taught him the star patterns that mapped the sky from season to season, how to read in them the position of the sun beneath the horizon, how to find north from the arrangement of the circling stars that never set. She taught him the long prayers that called on the ancient powers of the world, the words that had been spoken before Egypt existed, before the Nile had found its current course, when the world was still arranging itself into its present shape. She told him about his father with a care that balanced truth and tenderness. She did not soften what had happened or pretend that it had not been a cruelty. She told him that Osiris had been a king of extraordinary kindness, that his brother Set had overthrown him not through greater wisdom or greater strength but through deception, and that the world was still carrying the shape of that loss. She told him that when he was ready, the question of the throne would need to be answered. But she did not rush that telling, because the boy was still a boy, and the marsh was still the marsh, and there would be time enough for larger destinies later. Osiris himself did not return to rule Egypt as he once had. His body, though restored and honored, no longer belonged among the living. Instead, he descended into the Duat, the shadowed realm beneath the western horizon where the sun travels each night before rising again at dawn. The descent was not a fall. It was a crossing, like the crossing of the Nile from the eastern bank to the western, familiar in form even if entirely unfamiliar in destination. The Duat was not a dark or fearful place in the way that the word underworld might suggest to those who have not encountered it properly. It was complex, layered, full of corridors and courts and rivers of its own, ruled by its own geography, lit not by the sun but by a more diffuse radiance that seemed to come from the walls themselves, from the painted images of gods and stars and judgment scales that covered every surface. Osiris moved through it with the ease of someone who has always, in some fundamental way, belonged precisely where he finds himself. He came to the great hall at the heart of the Duat, a space so vast that its ceiling was lost in a pale mist, its floor tiled in black granite that reflected the lamplight in long golden shimmers. 42 assessors stood in 2 rows along the walls, one for each nome of Egypt, one for each variety of wrongdoing that a human heart might have harbored. And at the far end, Osiris took his throne. There, in halls lit by soft lamps of alabaster, Osiris took up his new role, one greater and stranger than any he had held before. He became the Lord of the afterlife, the judge before whom every soul would stand after death. In a great hall lined with painted images of lotus flowers and stars, the heart of each person who died would be placed upon a golden scale, balanced against a single feather taken from the goddess Ma'at, who embodied truth and harmony. If a heart proved light, unburdened by cruelty or deceit, its owner would pass into the peaceful fields of reeds beyond. If a heart proved heavy, weighed down by wrongdoing, a waiting creature called Amit, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus, would consume it, and that soul would simply cease to be. The dead arrived to this hall still wearing the faces of their living selves, still carrying in their bodies the memory of sunlight and bread and the particular way the Nile smelled after rain. They arrived confused, some of them, or frightened, not because the hall itself was frightening, but because death is always somewhat unexpected, even to those who saw it approaching for years. Osiris received each one with the same expression, attentive, unhurried, and without a trace of judgment before the scales had spoken. He presided over this hall with the same quiet compassion that had once guided his rule over the living. He was not a god of vengeance or fear, but one of balance and quiet justice, offering every soul the chance to be judged fairly according to how they had lived. The scribe Thoth stood to one side, recording the result of each weighing in his careful hand. Anubis tended the scales themselves, ensuring their balance with a precision that allowed no argument. Those whose hearts were light passed on into the field of reeds that lay beyond the hall, a paradise that opened like a gift through a set of tall wooden doors painted blue and green. They could hear, before those doors opened, the sound of wind moving through grain, the lowing of cattle in distant fields, the calling of birds at the edge of a river that never ran dry. The Aru, as the Egyptians called it, the field of reeds, was a place that bore the shape of everything the living world had offered at its most generous. It was not a kingdom of clouds or a realm of pure spirit. It was practical and sensory and real in the way that mattered most. It could be felt. The soil there was the same black silt that the Nile left behind each year after flooding, rich enough that seeds placed carelessly in it would grow without further attention. The light was the warm light of mid-morning, the best light of the Egyptian day, steady and clear without the crushing weight of afternoon heat. The dead lived there as they had lived in Egypt, farming the same crops, attending the same festivals, greeting neighbors across low mud brick walls in the evenings when the work was done and the sky went rose and amber at the edges. There were no kings in the field of reeds, no hierarchies enforced by fear or scarcity. What there was instead was time, long stretches of it, unhurried, in a landscape that did not decay or require the anxious management that the mortal world demanded. They spoke of Osiris there with the familiarity of neighbors rather than the awe of subjects. He had been a king who walked among them when he lived. He was a judge who listened when they stood before his scales. It seemed right to them that the place they had been given for eternity should carry his signature. Abundant, fair, tended by a hand that understood what the living needed and had always tried to provide it. In the years that followed, the story of Osiris settled into the bones of Egypt the way the Nile's silt settled into the soil each year after flooding, so completely that it became indistinguishable from the earth itself. Farmers who pressed seed into the black soil each planting season knew they were participating in a drama that had been playing out since the first king taught the first farmer how to read the river's rhythm. The grain that pushed through the surface in spring was spoken of as Osiris returning, green and insistent, from beneath the earth. When the flood came each year, swelling the river beyond its banks and covering the fields in a brown-gray sheet of water, people gathered on high ground and watched and spoke quietly of the body of Osiris resting in the depths. When the flood retreated and left behind its gift of dark, renewed soil, they spoke of his resurrection, his return, the proof that what the world had lost it could always, in some form, recover. He was painted on the walls of every tomb in Egypt, a green-skinned king, wrapped in white linen from the waist down, holding a crook and a flail crossed over his chest, wearing the tall white crown of the south. Green was the color of the living Nile Valley, of the wheat and barley and papyrus. They painted him green because they understood that he was not simply a king who had died. He was the principle of renewal itself, the force that returned each spring in the swelling grain and each night in the sun's passage through the underworld toward another dawn. Of all the places where Osiris was honored in Egypt, none carried more weight than Abydos, a city that lay near the edge of the desert not far from the river, in the long, quiet stretch of the Nile Valley where the cliffs came close on the western side and the light at dawn moved across the stone in shades of amber and rose. It was believed by many to be the place where Osiris's head had been found and buried, the most sacred of the shrines that the sisters had raised during their long search, and in consequence the entire city had grown, over centuries, into a place of pilgrimage. Temples were built there in successive reigns, each one larger than the last, each one adding to the accumulated weight of devotion that had settled over the site like sediment over riverbed stone. The most enduring of these temples was raised by the pharaoh Seti, whose builders worked for years to construct a sanctuary of exceptional care and beauty, with pillared halls and painted corridors and a list of every king who had reigned since the earliest days inscribed on its walls in careful hieroglyphs. Offerings were made in Abydos daily. Bread and beer and flowers, oil and linen, the same offerings that had been made in the simplest early temples when the first reed shrines were barely distinguishable from the marshland around them. Pilgrims traveled from every part of Egypt to visit, some carrying small boats on their shoulders so that they might launch them on the sacred lake within the temple precinct. It was considered among the most meaningful things a person could do before death, to make the journey to Abydos and stand in the hall where the memory of Osiris rested most deeply, to say one's own name in that place and feel the strange comfort of being known in a house where the dead were understood. Ordinary Egyptians who could not travel to Abydos in life asked to have their bodies taken there after death, for even a brief resting of the coffin on the road through that city was felt to carry a blessing. The roads around Abydos bore, in the season of greatest pilgrimage, the marks of countless journeys. The ruts of sledges carrying coffins, the worn hollows where generations of feet had paused to rest. Each year, when the Nile rose and spread its dark, fertile silt across the fields, the people of Egypt spoke of Osiris returning to the land that had once loved him as its king. They believed the flood itself carried something of his spirit, renewing the soil the way his teachings had once renewed the lives of the earliest farmers along the river. Temples were raised in his honor at Abydos, where pilgrims traveled to lay flowers and recite his story beneath painted columns, and where his memory was kept as gently as a lamp shielded from the wind. Isis remained beside him in memory and myth, honored as the devoted wife whose search had never wavered, whose love had reached beyond death itself to bring wholeness back to what had been broken. Horus grew within the reeds until he was ready to claim his father's stolen throne, carrying forward the promise that justice, however long delayed, would eventually find its way home. Set still ruled the desert, still sent his hot winds across the valley, still wore the face of something unresolved at the edge of the known world. Egypt held space for him too, for the desert was real, and its lord could not simply be written out of the story. What he had done was not forgotten, but the world continued regardless, turning through its seasons, flooding and receding, planting and harvesting, mourning and celebrating, the way it had since before the first family of gods had been born across 5 stolen days at the edge of the calendar. And so the story of Osiris settles, at last, into the quiet rhythm of the river that shaped it. Not an ending marked by triumph or sorrow alone, but a slow, steady turning, much like the Nile's own eternal cycle of flood and harvest, night and dawn, loss and gentle restoration. Somewhere beneath the western horizon, in a hall lit softly by lamps that never flicker, a wise king still sits upon his throne, weighing hearts with patience, remembering the fields he once taught the world to plant. Let your own thoughts drift now along that same dark river, carried gently downstream, past reeds swaying in a silence older than memory, toward the soft and waiting dark of sleep.